Coming in at number 10, we have Dungeons & Dragons Was Evil. I don't know about you guys, but I think Dungeons & Dragons is so much fun. You get to jump into a fantasy world and do whatever you want, be whoever you want, and just feel like an overall badass. And the best part is, most of this stuff is free. It's a game that requires a lot of time, but not a lot of loot. But unfortunately, back in the 80s, many religious groups saw this game as something satanic. I mean, you're pretending to be a wizard and whatnot, which is supposed to be very unholy. The news picked up this controversy and then started running stories about the dangers of Dungeons & Dragons and how it could corrupt children. There were massive protests to get the game banned, which is really hard because you literally only need a pen and paper to play it. On top of this, some people were even saying that kids were committing suicide after playing this game. I think we can all agree now that this game is harmless and actually very good for your mind because it helps you focus and you're constantly doing math. But this is how far it went. There was a TV movie called Mazes and Monsters that starred Tom Hanks. It came out in 1982 and it was a bunch of teens who played D&D and then go crazy from it. Coming in at number 9, we have Woodstock. If there was any doubt that the world had changed, Woodstock would shift the minds of the non-believers and scare everyone who is trying to hold on to the old ways. Woodstock was to be a massive music festival having some of the greatest artists of the era. People like The Who, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and the Grateful Dead were all set to perform there. The people who organized the event were expecting somewhere around 200,000 people. In terms of ticket sales, there was a little over 180,000 tickets sold. Well, it turns out that most of the people who planned to attend thought they would test their luck by sneaking in. The total number of attendees is still unknown, but people think it was somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000, with another million stuck in traffic trying to work their way into the festival. Because of this mass oversurge of people, any fences trying to hold people from getting in were torn down and mobs of attendees swarmed into the festival. Eventually, free admission was given to everyone and anarchy ensued. Rain poured down and dancing hippies empowered by LSD were grooving freely in the mud as some of the best bands in the world serenaded them with music. If I could go back in time for something, this would be one of those things.
At number 8, we have Sherry Pearson, September 12th, 1993. Firefighters rushed to a house on fire located on Garden Street, Kendallville, Indiana. Sherry's neighbors saw smoke pouring from the windows of the house and promptly called the police. By the time firefighters got there, the house had already been ablaze for 45 minutes already, and upon entering, they found 27-year-old Sherry Pearson dead in the living room. Now, thankfully, her 2 children were visiting their dad at the time since the couple had separated a few months prior, but were apparently trying to work things out. Now, the case was originally ruled as an accident, blaming faulty wiring for the fire starting, but that wasn't the case. Investigators realized the fire started in the bedroom and some type of accelerant had been poured all over the bedroom as well as in other spots around the house. So this was now a case of arson and, more importantly, homicide. The batteries on the fire alarm had also been removed, meaning that they were never going to save her. Autopsy results showed that Sherry had been injected with some unknown foreign substance before her death. Officers concluded she had been drugged before the fire was set, but the culprit was never found. Going at number 7 slot is Zombie Road. Located in Wildwood, Missouri, this road is a site of multiple scary stories. For one, it's said to be incredibly haunted both by the spirits of the indigenous community who once lived on the land and by the spirits of victims who were killed by the trains that used to use the tracks there. One murderer who goes by the name of Zombie, hence the name of the road, escaped a mental asylum and allegedly started using this road as his home base, no doubt satisfying his murderous urges at the same time. The road is now a nature trail, but it's closed every night for safety reasons, and there are hefty fines for trespassers, so don't even think about it.
Coming in at number 6, we have the Cabbage Patch Wars. Now, this isn't the war you'll read about in the history books because I kind of just made it up, but here's what's actually true. During the 80s, the American economy was at a huge upswing. Consumerism was at an all-time high, and one of the biggest things on the market was the newly coveted Cabbage Patch Kids doll. Everyone wanted one, so most stores were selling out faster than they could keep them in stock. This led to Black Friday style fights over dolls. There were several occasions where people would throw down right in the middle of a Kmart to try and beat the hell out of someone so they could walk away with the prize of a stuffed toy they saw on TV. What a crazy world. Thank God we don't live like that anymore. Just kidding, we still do that stuff all the time. Coming in at number 5, we have the North Carolina sit-ins. This story is scary because it makes you think that within our parents' lifetime, black people had to fight for the right just to sit down and eat at a restaurant. In February of 1964, black students sat down at a diner in North Carolina. They were coming in to grab some lunch, and this should have been a very standard transaction. Well, the people who owned and operated this establishment decided that they would deny these men service, and instead of walking out after being treated like second-class citizens, these 4 men started a protest that would change America forever. They refused to leave. This caught media attention, and from this, other students, churchgoers, and even other business owners came into support. These sit-ins lasted for 6 months before desegregation laws were put in place in North Carolina.
At number 4 is Diane Orgett, April 10th, 1998. Around Good Friday, a Florida woman called Diane Orgett was reported missing by her mum. Her mum went on to say Diane suffered from addiction and mental illness and was drawn to and easily trusting of men, especially men with money. Now, it's still up in the air whether she left on purpose because of a man or whether it was actually an abduction. A few days after her disappearance, she left a worrying message on her mum's answering phone. In the message, she screams, "Help, help," before you hear a sound of some sort of scuffle and then someone else saying, "Hey, gimme that," before the message ends. She tried calling back, but there was no answer. So at this point, okay, it sounds like she's being held hostage by this man, or maybe this was a romantic situation gone very wrong. 2 days later, the tip of Diane's middle finger was found on the side of the road she'd been seen walking down. A week later, her clothes were found folded in a bag and disposed of in the freezer of a random convenience store. Totally normal location to do that. Another bag filled with her makeup was found in another store and it was labeled Diane. Again, the case was just never solved, but I have a feeling that Diane is dead. Filling at number 3 slot is the poltergeist backstory. In Feb and March of 1958, the Herman family started experiencing all sorts of paranormal poltergeist activity. They had lids and bottle caps popping off in their kitchen, bookshelves falling over, and a statue of the Virgin Mary being thrown across the room and smashing a mirror that was 12 feet away. I don't know, something about a poltergeist trying to destroy religious symbols doesn't exactly seem friendly to me, you know what I mean? And the Herman seemed to agree, and I mean, no shit. Even when they got a cop to come and check it out, he was almost struck by a glow being thrown across the room at him. Eventually, the family called in priests and ministers from other religions to conduct rituals and exorcisms on the house, but even that didn't work. Then suddenly, as quickly as everything started happening, it all stopped. The family moved out after the haunting ceased, but I don't know, I feel like I would have moved out as soon as the first light bulb exploded. Like, I don't have time for that. I don't want to risk my chances with that. I'm not doing it.
Coming in at number 2, we have Reagan gets hit. Becoming president seems cool in theory right before someone shoots you right in the chest. That's right, in 1981, the newly elected president Ronald Reagan was shot while walking out of a building in DC. If I was him, I would have fired my intelligence guys after this, because this guy was able to slip a bullet through and hit Reagan right in the chest. But apparently it takes more than bullets to slow this old man down, because he didn't stop ticking. This guy is like the Terminator or something. But the guy who shot him, John Hinckley Jr., was captured and was actually found not guilty due to reasons of insanity. Of course, he wasn't allowed to walk free. He had to spend 30 years in a mental institution. The reason Hinckley said he shot the president was to impress Jodie Foster. I don't think it really worked. And for the number 1 spot, we have the Freedom Summer murders. In the summer of 1964, 3 men went missing. James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schuiner were all civil rights activists working in Mississippi. They were going to black neighborhoods, helping black people get registered to vote so they could have a voice in their communities. They had just finished speaking with a black community in Mississippi that had their church burned to the ground. They were driving out of town when they were pulled over. They were held in police custody for a few hours and then they were released. The 3 men went missing not long after that. Once this caught media attention, a large-scale search was launched and the bodies of the 3 men were found. They had all been murdered by a shot to the head. The state refused to investigate this case, so the FBI got involved. They found that the Mississippi police, the Philadelphia police, and the Ku Klux Klan were all involved. 21 people were arrested and 7 people were sentenced.
Starting off at number 10 is the Dyatlov Pass incident. On February 1st and 2nd, 1959, 9 Russian hikers mysteriously died on the Ural Mountains. It wasn't your normal exposure to the elements or attack by a wild not animal either, and nobody knows how it happened. When their campsite was found, the tents had all been shredded from the inside out. But the weirdest part was how the bodies were found. For one, it appeared that they left the campsite of their own accord, but many of them were naked except for their underwear. Why would they just leave like that? Plus, one of the hikers was found dead with crazy amounts of radiation coming off of him. Others showed intense physical trauma, including a fractured skull and major chest fractures. Even more gruesome, one victim was missing both its eyes and another was missing their tongue. Other hikers reported years later that on the night of the incident they saw strange orange orbs in the sky. Autopsies show that their injuries weren't caused by animals or people, so what could have caused it? Natural elements aren't going to rip your tongue out or cause your body to be radioactive, and to this day nobody knows the true story of what happened to them. But I did a video on all the theories that could have happened to them, so check it out if you haven't already.
Coming in at number 9, we have a burning plane. On February 27th, 1980, a standard flight would turn into many people's scariest moment. A flight was landing in Manila and things didn't go exactly as planned. It hit the runway a little too hard and bounced. This caused the plane to catch on fire with 124 passengers and 11 crew members stuck on board. People started to jump out of the plane onto the tarmac so they didn't die in the billowing flames. And in all this chaos, only one person died, mostly because of the bravest flight attendant who has ever walked the earth. Wang Huang stood at the door of the plane, grabbing people who couldn't move and threw them off the plane to safety. The news article said that even while her clothes were on fire, she still continued to save lives. What is this lady doing as a flight attendant? She should be in the army or something. Huang had some minor injuries, but if it wasn't for her, many more people would have died on that flight. Coming in at number 8, we have John Lennon meets Yoko Ono. Many music fans will see this as the downfall of the Beatles. Once John and Yoko were involved with one another, things started to change big time. She had a very small musical background, but John would let her have input on the songs that the band was developing. This eventually put a wedge between all of the members of the Beatles. I mean, I would be pretty choked too if I helped build one of the biggest bands in the world, and then someone in the band let their new date start calling the shots. There's even a famous video where John Lennon is performing with rock and roll legend Chuck Berry. Lennon gets Yoko to play with them in the band, and she includes some very strange screaming noises.
On the south side, high up on the ridge, just a half a mile from the Mississippi.
Filling on the 7th slot is Nicola Payne. December 14th, 1991. Nicola was going to the shops to pick up some clothes for her son. The walk from her boyfriend's house to her parents was quite short and should have taken her around 10 minutes even in super bad conditions. But somehow, out of nowhere, she just vanished. Even sniffer dogs and helicopters could find zero trace of Nicola, but one anonymous man apparently could. He kept calling the Payne family, claiming he saw a man carrying a drunk individual along that road. The case went cold for another 5 years, despite a lot of excavation having taken place. 2 men were arrested for the murder, but both have been found not guilty due to lack of evidence. What's important to not forget here is that sex worker Barbara Finn also disappeared around the same time Nicola did, and both had pretty similar physical features. Authorities hypothesized it could have been Scottish serial killer Peter Tobin, but again, zero evidence. Now at number 6 is the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. While it was initially opened in 1864, it wasn't until the 1950s that it reached its absolute capacity of 2,400 patients. Oh, and it was originally only designed to hold 250 people. This massive overcrowding led to a lot of inhumane conditions, including lack of heat, people being held in cages, and lobotomies being performed apparently to try and fix the overcrowding problem. Naturally, patients started becoming violent, attacking staff and setting fires. And to this day, the building is listed as one of the most haunted in America.
Coming in at number 5, we have the Time Man of the Year 1982. Now think back to the 80s, specifically to the year 1982. Who do you think would have been the most influential person of that year? So important that they would have been put on the cover of Time magazine. Well, it was none other than the computer. It was a trick question. It wasn't a person at all. It was a thing that was revolutionizing the world and continues to shape our world to this day. Now, why would I put it on a list of scary things? Well, because it's kind of freaky. If we do head towards a future where robots take over the world and we all become human slaves, we will look back to the cover of that magazine as the birthplace of our demise. I mean, Hitler was also the man time of the year. I'm just saying. I mean, we're probably all gonna be fine, and I'm probably just being a drama queen, but maybe I'm right. Coming in at number 4, we have Malcolm X assassination. In 1965, Malcolm X was set to speak at the Audubon Ballroom in Manhattan. During his speech, there was a disturbance in the crowd, and while Malcolm X tried to calm the situation, a man snuck up and shot him with a shotgun. This caused the crowd to run, and in the chaos, 2 more men ran up to Malcolm X and shot him with automatic weapons. Malcolm X was rushed to the hospital, but he was dead before he arrived. He was shot 21 times. The minds behind this attack are still in question. Some people suspect that the FBI had some involvement since they had been monitoring him since the 1950s. But Malcolm X had been receiving death threats from supporters of the Nation of Islam since he denounced the following and started his own branch of Islamic worship. The man created a lot of enemies, so it's hard to pinpoint who could have done this.
Filling at number 3 slot is the British millionaire. December 10th, 1996. 54-year-old millionaire Richard Watson was on his way home, and as soon as he entered his property, he heard a gunshot. His stepdaughter claimed he said, "No, get away from me, not again, leave me alone, get away from me." When she finally stepped outside, she saw that Richard had been shot in the neck twice by a man wearing joggers. 6 months later, his wife Linda and daughter Amanda were arrested in a sting operation at Gatwick Airport for the murder of Richard. The police were convinced the two had hired a hitman to kill him. In the months leading up to his murder, he'd been visited by 2 men outside his family home. There had been 2 break-ins at his office, and a man had even been caught writing down his number plate. Maybe Linda and Amanda wanted the money but didn't want the blame, so they hired a hitman. People always have some kind of beef with rich people anyway, so maybe it was just someone who Richard had wronged. We don't know. Now at number 2 is Overtoun Bridge. This one's more of a sad mystery than it is a horror story per se. Since the 1950s, the Overtoun Bridge has seen dogs jump from it at insane rates, approximately 1 per month, and nobody knows why they do it either. Dogs that survived the 50-foot drop who are taken back to the bridge often try to do it again, and it isn't even like it's random either. All the dogs jumped from the same side of the bridge in clear weather, and all of the dogs were breeds that had longer snouts. Maybe they're smelling something that makes them do it.
Coming in at the number 1 spot, we have AIDS is discovered. Nothing like a decade of free love to be followed by the most deadly sexually transmitted disease of all time. I mean, we're just trying to have a little fun over here. Throughout the early 80s, a new sickness was attacking the immune system of people. It was completely unknown what this sickness was. It wasn't until 1983 that the virus was labeled. Now, when we look back through history, it's thought that the first contraction of AIDS was probably in the 1930s, but it wasn't making headlines until the 1980s. And with this discovery came widespread fear, and with the fear, just like anything else, came misinformation. People thought the virus had something to do with the gay community, that it was a homosexual disease. It was thought that infected people would die in a few weeks, that people could catch AIDS through just touching someone. This led to widespread panic and horrible stigmas put on gay communities. Coming in at number 10, we have the anti-war demonstrations. The Vietnam War was raging throughout the 60s, and many people did not agree with America's involvement. On top of this, the government was still able to conscript people and force them to fight in a war that they didn't support. The public opinion on conscription had shifted, and the younger generation wanted to be heard. They started a radical movement to force the government to listen. They would march in the streets, they would hang posters all over cities, they would vandalize property, they would have sit-ins, they would even set buildings on fire. I wonder where we have seen this recently. It's almost like you should listen to people before they're forced to walk out in the streets and tear everything apart, because if you don't, they will quickly remind you that the power is within the public and you need to pay attention.
Coming in at number 9 is the Los Feliz murder mansion. Early December 1959, a horrific murder-suicide took place. One night, Dr. Harold Perelson murdered his wife with a double-ended hammer, and Harold then decided to kill himself by drinking acid. Apparently, everyone who has spent any amount of time near the house has reported feeling an incredible sense of dread and a need to run away from it. I mean, energies, they're a thing. That home definitely holds a lot of darkness, and I 100% would not be surprised if it was haunted.
Coming in at number 8, we have Just Say No. America has always had a strange relationship with drugs. They keep trying to keep them out, but it also seems like the CIA started the crack epidemic. So who really knows what's going on behind the scenes? But one of the big pushes in the 80s was the Just Say No campaign, that kicking addiction was as easy as just saying no. It's just a little willpower, that's all you need. And I put this on a list of scary things because that's a terrible message to send out to people, and we're still seeing the ripple effects to this day. Telling people to just say no to get off drugs ignores all the links between drugs and mental health, the effect of your social economic situation, and the fact that drug companies are peddling the gateway drugs. Forget about calling alcohol and cannabis gateway drugs. What about Ritalin? That's speed. Thankfully, we have a much more open mind when it comes to helping people with addiction problems.
At number 8, we have Jose Delgado's mind control. In the 1950s, Delgado decided to experiment with electricity and use it to control the brain activity of animals, and it actually worked. He was able to control not only the emotions but also the actions of animals by stimulating their brains with the electricity. The real horror comes from when he expanded his test from animals to mental patients. While he claims that these patients were volunteers, there are a lot of allegations that he implanted them with the brain control mechanism against their will. And in a truly Orwellian hypothesis, in the 1970s, Delgado was quoted as saying someday armies and generals will be controlled by electric stimulation of the brain, which is absolutely horrifying.
Coming in at number 7, we have the demonic Teddy Ruxpin. If you don't remember Teddy Ruxpin, then just think about Furbies. And if you don't remember what Furbies are, then just think about if you took Siri and stuffed it in a teddy bear, but it was even more useless. Teddy Ruxpin was a marvel of its time, a talking animatronic bear that you could bring home. All the kids wanted this toy so bad. They were going absolutely ballistic for it. But a little while after the launch, children were terrified of this little stuffed bear. Some parents thought that the devil had possessed the toy and was gonna bring harm to their family. Well, it turns out this was a minor scare, and it all came from the batteries running out in the Teddy Ruxpin. With less power, the voice would slow down to the point where it sounded like a demon. And with this being new tech on the market and with people not knowing how to react, they did what people always do when they don't know how to react. They freaked out. At number 7, we have another Kennedy is assassinated. This adds fuel to the fire of someone being out to kill the Kennedys. I doubt we will ever know who's behind this unless we break into the CIA headquarters and hack into all the crazy information that they're hiding. But in 1968, Robert Kennedy was campaigning and he was doing well. There was a very good chance that he could become the next president. He had been victorious in the California primaries, which was a huge swing his way. Usually the Democratic candidate who wins California has a great shot at becoming president. He went out to address the voters and he was shot. He didn't die immediately, but he died after a short stay in the hospital. Some people say he died from his wounds, while other people think that someone came in and poisoned him while he was so vulnerable. Coming in at number 6, we have the first Walmart opens. Now this event is not scary. It's just one store and probably a great day for Sam Walton, who opened up the very first store in Arkansas. But think about where this went. It went from a place in the 60s that wanted to bring you low prices to one of the biggest chains in the world that will literally move into a small town and knowingly destroy every other local business because they can't compete. Who would think that a company with a 60-year head start and an insane amount of capital would have the advantage? Not to mention that they gouge their providers, forcing them to sell their products at insanely low prices so they can do the same for the consumer. And you might think, well, this is good for me, but in reality, this destroys the local economy and gets everyone dependent on monopoly, which leads to a massive economic crash like the one we're in right now. So yeah, that's scary.
Now at number 6 is Claire Morrison, December 19th, 1992. This one's a tough one because there are so many conflicting stories of what she was doing the night before she died. On the 18th, Claire Morrison was at Geelong Mall in Australia and she told her friend she was going to catch the bus home to get some money, but that's the last time they would ever see her alive. Witnesses claim they saw Claire drunk walking around town, and 18-year-old Shane McLaren told police he saw her getting into a blue car with 2 men, which later turned out to be a complete lie. Claire's brother Andrew said her and her friends went to the cliffs that overlooked Bell Beach, but she failed to leave with them when they left. The next morning her body was found, hence the exact cause of death could not be found. Since Shane was the only one who was linked to the case and who had also lied about it, he was automatically the #1 suspect, and the fact she was addicted to crystal meth just didn't help his case at all. Regardless, someone did hurt Claire before throwing her into the water to be left dead for sharks, but we just don't know who it was. Coming in at number 5 are The Rocks, August 27th, 1991. 28-year-old Marcia Gippin and her friend Stanley were driving west on the I-70 to pick up her 2 daughters who were staying with her parents. As the two went under the Manhattan Road underpass in Putnam County, Indiana, 2 huge rocks, both heavier than 15 pounds each, were thrown on them from the overpass. The first rock broke through her windshield, hitting Marcia in the head, killing her instantly. The second one bounced off the hood and hit Stanley, but he somehow managed to stop the car. As he was trying to stop other cars for help, help, another 2 rocks were thrown over, hitting a truck driven by 23-year-old Kimberly Shuttler. The rock shattered the leg of her passenger James, but she was thankfully uninjured. James and Stanley were airlifted to a hospital, but Marcia ended up being killed due to multiple critical injuries. Witnesses claim they saw 2 males in their teens getting away from the overpass in a dark truck, but the worst part of all of this was that this wasn't even an isolated incident. It had happened a lot in the months leading up to August, and 7 other motorists had reported the incidents. Coming in at number 5 is Poinsett Bridge. Located in South Carolina, the bridge was constructed back in 1820. It's apparently now home to the ghost of a man who was killed when he got into a car crash there in the 50s. Since then, people who dare to walk through the bridge at night have reported seeing floating orbs, random lights, and hearing disembodied ghostly voices. People think that the lights that they can see could be the headlights of the ghost's car, reliving the moment it crashed for the rest of eternity.
Coming in at number 4, we have the Challenger disaster. Some of you may be aware of the tragic event that took place in 1986. There was a rocket that was set to go out to space, and it had teachers on board, which was a big deal. So much of a big deal that school children all over America were watching it on live TV. Someone kids felt attached to was going to go into space, somewhere where few people had gone before. This idea was going to give a generation of kids the hope and interest to go into space and travel the vast unknown. And then just a little over a minute after takeoff, a faulty O-ring burst, which caused fuel to leak and ignite. The Challenger shuttle exploded in the air, and chunks of debris rained down into the ocean, and the 7 crew members on board were killed. The whole event was remembered as one of the worst disasters in space travel history.
At number 4 are the Pollock twins. In 1957, Joanna and Jacqueline Pollock both passed away in a car accident. 1 year later, their mother gave birth to 2 more twins, named Jillian and Jennifer. As soon as these twins were old enough to talk, they immediately began asking for toys that belonged to their deceased sisters that they had never seen before. They even recognized landmarks that only Joanna and Jacqueline would have known, and stranger still, they would get panicked at the sight of cars, saying things like, "That car is coming to get us." I don't know about you, but to me it sounds like they remembered both their past lives and their deaths. Is this reincarnation we have? I'm not really sure.
Coming in at number 3, we have the mass exodus of Cuba. Dictatorships are a terrible thing, and in 1980, over 100,000 Cubans said that they had had enough and it was time to move to somewhere else. So they jumped on boats and they headed towards Florida. This was a grueling trip, but it was worth it to save their families and their future generations from the conditions that they were forced to live in. Thank God this happened, because it saved thousands of lives and brought the Cuban sandwich to America. Have you ever had a Cuban sandwich? They are amazing. Coming in at number 3, we have Bloody Sunday. Back in the 60s, a group of civil rights leaders got together in Alabama to protest the fact that black voters were denied the right to vote in many states. This protest would be a march from Selma, Alabama to the capital of Montgomery, and of course Martin Luther King would be marching with them. They all met at a church and set off to make the walk. Initially, they were not met with any resistance, but it wasn't long after they started that they came to a blockade of riot police. The police gassed and attacked the protesters until they were forced to stop and retreat back to the church in Selma. This was a disgusting display, and honestly, going back to watch the footage is heart-wrenching. The good news is that this display caught the president's attention, and he spoke out before Congress about his support for the cause. This led to another march from Selma to Montgomery, which now had the support of the president and the National Guard. This protest took 5 days, and by the end of the march, there were 25,000 protesters marching with them. This display eventually led to the Voters Act, which prohibited racial discrimination towards voters. Coming in at number 2, we have the March on Washington. Once again, this is put on this list to highlight how people used to be treated and how that would be terrifying. The March on Washington was so black Americans could have civil rights. That's it. They just wanted civil rights. They had to fight for the right to be treated like everyone else, and even though things changed in a very positive way after this, we can still see the effects of racism running rampant throughout America. The March on Washington was sparked when President Kennedy spoke before Congress proposing the Civil Rights Act, which would protect the civil and economic rights of black Americans. To ensure that this act was passed, civil rights leaders including Martin Luther King planned a peaceful march They would march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. This display was massive, and 250,000 people marched along with them in solidarity. This was to show their support for the cause. It's scary to think that not that long ago, black people had to fight the government for a law to be passed so they could be treated like human beings.
Now at number 2 is Carmen Van Huss. March 22nd, 1990. 19-year-old Indianapolis local Carmen Hope Van Huss was on her way back from the hospital after visiting her sick grandma. She dropped off her brother and dad before going home to her own apartment and arriving at around 11 p.m. Neighbors saw her with a man talking and laughing going towards her apartment. At around 1 or 1:30 a.m., neighbors heard her shouting, get off me," followed by footsteps leaving the apartment. Instead of calling the police like any normal person, the neighbors called the landlord and a noise complaint notice was just left on her door. I'm pretty sure if I heard my neighbor shouting, get off me, I would not call the landlord, I would bloody call the police. Then the next morning, after failing to show up to her shift at work, her manager was worried and alerted Carmen's dad, James. James had also been trying to reach Carmen's phone, but with no result, he went to her apartment. There, he found her door unlocked and the whole apartment in utter chaos. Carmen's body was on the floor, nothing was stolen, and all her exes were interviewed, but they had all been out of state at the time of the crime. Her case remains cold. And finally, at number 1 is Norway's most well-known murder, May 6, 1995. Birgitte Teng's body was found dead in a bush by the side of a dirt road. The night before, Birgitte traveled to downtown Kopervik, and right before midnight, she hiked a ride to the city. Eyewitnesses remembered seeing her walking down the main street, but that was the last live sighting of her. The weapon, a 23-kilogram bloody rock, was found next to her. Further investigation showed she had been dragged to the location, killed only 400 meters away from her own home. The first break in the case was the blonde hair that she was found clutching that was not hers. The police spent ages trying to find a long-haired blonde man before DNA testing came back again, saying the hair actually was hers. The biggest suspect in the case was her cousin, who was seen acting extremely weird during her funeral. He also had a history of inappropriately touching a girl and public exposure. After being interrogated for 180 hours, he ended up confessing but later took it back. He won the case due to lack of evidence, and her killer is still at large. And I mean, you guys, we've seen so many cases where someone, after being interrogated for literally days on end, will just confess because they think they've done it when they actually haven't, and they're just in a state of delirium. And that could have very well been Brigitte's cousin. And finally, at number 1 is Ed Gein, the infamous serial killer. Ed confessed to the murders of Mary Hogan in 1954 and Bernice Worden in 1957. But that's not even the messed up part. What makes this case so disturbing is everything that the police found when they were searching Ed Gein's house. Balls made from human skulls, and skulls on his bedpost, and so much more, but you guys seem to get the gist. The man liked skin-covered furniture.